You fill out a form somewhere in India, and there's a category box near the bottom. You might not think twice about it, but that box carries the weight of thousands of years, and almost nobody who checks it actually knows where the system inside it came from. Most people outside India assume caste is simple: a four-tier ladder, fixed since the beginning of time, priests at the top, everyone else stacked below. That picture is almost entirely wrong. Not because caste isn't real or consequential. It's real, and it has shaped lives in ways that still matter today. But the story of where it came from and what it originally meant is far stranger and far more contested than the simple ladder suggests. So, where did it actually begin? And why do so many people inside and outside India believe a version of the story that historians have spent decades complicating? Start with the word itself, because there isn't just one word. The English word caste actually comes from the Portuguese casta, meaning lineage or breed, brought by colonial traders in the 16th century. But in India, there were always two separate concepts being folded into that single foreign word. The first is varna, a fourfold classification appearing in the earliest layers of the Rig Veda, composed roughly 3,500 years ago. The second is jati, the thousands of localized, occupation-based communities that actually structure daily life across the subcontinent. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is where most misunderstanding starts. Varna appears in a famous hymn called the Purusha Sukta, part of the Rig Veda, which describes a cosmic being whose body gives rise to four groups: priests from the mouth, warriors from the arms, merchants and farmers from the thighs, laborers from the feet. It's a creation myth, not a legal code. Historians have long debated whether this hymn describes an already existing social order or was actually a late addition to the Rig Veda, composed to justify a hierarchy that was still solidifying. The historian Romila Thapar has argued that early Vedic society was considerably more fluid than the four-part model implies, with occupation and status shifting across generations in ways the later texts obscure. Jati is a different animal entirely. Where Varna offers four broad categories, jati refers to thousands of specific, localized communities, often tied to a particular craft, trade, or region. A weaver community in one district and a weaver community 200 kilometers away might not even consider themselves part of the same group. Jati identities were flexible enough that entire communities could and did renegotiate their status over centuries, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, depending on economic power, military patronage, or religious alliance. Here's the detail that surprises most people. For most of Indian history, this system was not a single, unified structure imposed from above. It was intensely local, endlessly variable, and constantly being renegotiated. There was no central authority enforcing a nationwide hierarchy. What existed instead were thousands of overlapping, regionally specific arrangements, some rigid, many surprisingly permeable. So how did we get from that fluid, regional patchwork to the rigid, nationwide system many people imagine today? This is where the story takes its most uncomfortable turn, and it has less to do with ancient India than with something much more recent. The historian Nicholas Dirks, in his research on colonial India, made the case that British administrators, trying to govern a subcontinent whose social organization they found bewildering, began treating caste as the master key to Indian society. Colonial census operations, starting in the late 19th century, required every Indian to be sorted into a single, fixed caste category. Officials consulted ancient texts, particularly law codes like the Manusmriti, and used them as if they were binding legal documents describing present-day reality rather than aspirational or regionally contested writings from centuries earlier. Think about what that actually did. A system that had been locally negotiated, contextually flexible, and often contested for over 1,000 years was suddenly frozen into fixed bureaucratic categories, stamped onto official records, and used to determine access to land, education, and employment. The fluidity that had characterized jati for centuries was replaced almost overnight by rigid administrative classification. The colonial state didn't invent caste, but it hardened something that had never been quite so hard before. The sociologist Susan Bailey has described this process as less a discovery of ancient Indian tradition and more a construction, one that combined real pre-colonial hierarchies with the administrative obsessions of a colonial bureaucracy trying to make an unfamiliar society legible on paper. The census forms didn't just record caste. In an important sense, they helped produce the version of caste that persisted afterward. This doesn't mean caste-based discrimination and hierarchy are colonial inventions with no pre-colonial roots. That would be its own kind of oversimplification. Hierarchies, exclusion, and occupational stratification existed well before European colonization, documented across centuries of regional inscriptions, temple records, and legal texts. What changed was the rigidity, the scale, and the bureaucratic permanence of the system. A living, locally contested set of arrangements became something closer to a fixed identity card. Why does this matter for how you think about caste today? Because the popular narrative, the one that treats caste as an unbroken 4,000-year-old ladder handed down from ancient scripture, flattens a much messier reality. It ignores centuries of regional variation, social mobility, and contestation. It also, less obviously, lets a more recent historical actor off the hook. If caste rigidity is purely ancient, purely religious, purely a product of scripture written millennia ago, there's less reason to examine how a 19th century colonial bureaucracy reshaped it into something more fixed and more consequential than it had ever been before. There's a broader pattern here, one that shows up whenever a complex, regionally varied social system gets compressed into a single origin story. Complexity is uncomfortable. A clean narrative, ancient scripture creates rigid hierarchy is far easier to hold in your mind than the actual history. Overlapping regional systems, shifting occupational identities, centuries of renegotiation, followed by a colonial administration that froze the whole thing into something resembling a modern, bureaucratic category. Consider what this means for a single family's story across generations. A community's position in the social order 200 years ago might have looked entirely different from its position 400 years before that. Military service to a regional ruler could elevate a community's standing within a generation. Economic decline could lower it just as quickly. The rigid permanence people associate with caste today owes at least as much to the frozen categories of a colonial census as it does to anything written in an ancient hymn. So the next time you see that category box on a form or hear caste described as an unchanging 4,000-year-old system, remember what the historical record actually shows. A fluid, regionally negotiated set of social arrangements, reshaped and hardened by a relatively recent colonial administration trying to make an unfamiliar society easier to govern on paper. You fill out that form, and the box near the bottom carries centuries of weight, but it isn't the weight of an unbroken ancient tradition. It's the weight of something far more human and far more recent than most people realize.